Okay, so we're going to continue with a discussion on early adulthood. Let me get the file up. It should be here. Slideshow. All right. So in this lesson, we're going to talk about early adulthood. Now, early adulthood, if we were going to describe it, we would say we're talking about your 20s through your 40s. Now, there is something called emerging adulthood, which is from 18 to about 25. And emerging adulthood is an intermediary stage between adolescence and early adulthood. Some people debate whether it should belong in the adulthood stage. Some people debate whether it belongs in adolescence. Usually, I describe this as an extension of adolescence when we talk about emerging adulthood. But all right, so when we talk about adulthood, so what are some of the things we see? Well, how you view or think about adulthood, it's influenced by the proportion of people who are adults. Now, that's important because post World War II, there was something called the baby boomer generation. And it's called a baby boomer because they had a massive amount of individuals, of children post war. And that actually has increased a lot of people for the workforce. Actually, many of these people are now fading out of the workforce. But this creates challenges because there are a lot of well educated individuals who are in heavy competition for professional positions or managerial positions. So, when we say early adulthood, let's talk about 20 somethings. Well, when we look at the 20 somethings, so this is 20 to 29, young adults are far more ethnically diverse in the United States than in previous generations. I think that's important to note that waves of immigration play a role in this. But our view of this generation is not fully conceptualized or evolved. What's interesting, what we know is that at least 40% of today's young adults spend some time in a single parent home. So that tells you that the rate of non marriage and the rate of divorce has gone up since previous generations. And nearly half of young adults are staying home with their parents later while they go to college or while they're establishing a career. If you look back to the early 1900s, middle 1900s, you would see that by about 18, people were already establishing their family. And that's not the case anymore. People are staying home till their mid to late 20s while they're going to college. And people, if they get married, are marrying later and they're delaying childbirth. So we see all of these things are trends we're noticing. We don't fully have a picture of what's going to happen going forward, but this is what we're seeing now. All right. How about the various age periods and how we view aging? So there is something called consciousness, which is concern or worry about getting old. And that has developed rapidly in the last 150 years based on some of the developments in education, psychology, medicine. All of these factors play a role. Now, what's interesting is that in the United States, people view adults of all ages in a favorable way. Now, but if we were to look at adulthood, older adults are viewed less favorably relative to younger adults. So early adulthood is considered a prime of one's life, and the emphasis on youthfulness and vitality, there's more of an emphasis towards women than men. So women have more concerns about age consciousness, and and in terms of feeling like they're aging, they're viewed as aging much more rapidly. So when we talk about adulthood, we have different kinds of aging. We have biological aging, which sounds exactly what it is. It's your chronological age. Uh, but we also have social aging, which is um, a set of expectations that one has related to um, expectations related to one's age bracket. So when you're younger, you might have a different set of expectations to when you get older. And some of the expectations of early adulthood, which we'll talk about, are things like getting a job, moving out of one's house, settling down. These are the kind of things that are related to um, age related norms for early adulthood. All right. Now, people also look at their life in terms of life events. So some events are related to social clocks, but many events are not related to social clocks. Uh, Marriage, um, things like getting a job, those are more likely. Now, in terms of physical development in early adulthood, your physical performance, you're in your physical prime in early adulthood. So we see that you have your greatest strength, speed, agility around the ages of 18 to 30. And then there tends to be deterioration in physical performance in your 30s and 40s. What's interesting, actually, before I move on, what's interesting is if we look at athletes, that tells a story too. Um, Many professional athletes maybe in the professional leagues 5 years at most. If you're a superstar, you're probably going to be there longer. But what is it about um, athletes that they are maybe in the league about 5 years? The answer is that their physical performance starts to decline. And as you start to decline in physical performance, then you have greater competition for your job. Other factors related to physical development is our physical health. Now, our relative health in early adulthood, I said we tend to be at our prime, but there are a lot of factors that play a role in one's physical health, things like heredity, right? We can have predispositions for certain health problems. Our nutrition plays a massive role, right? And what's interesting is that how we eat as children serves as an example or a model for how we eat in adulthood. So if we eat poorly, then we're more likely to eat poorly in adulthood. Um, then we have issues like exercise, right? So when you start working, you tend to have less time on your hands, less time to exercise, and that impacts one's health as well. So other illnesses, things like that. Now, when we talk about high risk behaviors, so some of the behaviors in adolescence and early adulthood put people at a greater risk for HIV and AIDS. Um, you may have heard the hashtag YOLO, right? So the hashtag YOLO, you only live once, gives the impression that just live your life. Don't worry about consequence, but that puts the age bracket of 20 to 29 at a very high risk for HIV and AIDS and other sexually transmitted diseases. Now, another issue is that people conflate birth control with STDs. Birth control pills, or or even condoms for that matter, they protect against an unplanned child, but they don't protect against health issues like STIs. Now, if we were to look at a graphic representation of deaths tied to drugs and alcohol, which is another common concern in early adulthood. We have massive amounts of deaths related to cigarette smoking. So there's about nearly 500,000 people die annually from cigarette smoking, which is quite alarming when you think about it. And then you have the other issues of cancer, stroke, and whatnot, heart disease. Now, moving to alcohol, alcohol is embedded in college life and is embedded in the social fabric of the United States. Um, so we see about 2 out of every 3 adults are drinking alcohol. Now, we're not saying they're abusing alcohol, but they're drinking alcohol. So it's very, very common in the United States, unless you have some religious or cultural prohibition against alcohol, which, for example, in the Islamic tradition, alcohol use is forbidden. So, but for the more secular Western societies in the United States, alcohol is part of the culture. But it is addictive, and people can develop a tolerance for alcohol, which means they're going to drink more and more. And then in college life, it might be part of the partying experience, right? So there are a lot of factors at play, which results in alcohol being the third leading cause of lifestyle related deaths in the United States. And lifestyle related deaths have what to do with things that you have choice over. So alcohol takes many lives. So that's something to consider. And then when we talk about other drug use, so we talked about tobacco or nicotine, we talked about alcohol, but other drug use, we see that about a quarter of people who are 18 to 20-year-olds reported using some illicit drug in the past month. And illicit means it's illegal. Now, these statistics are a little bit complicated by the fact that on a federal level, marijuana, which is the most common drug people use, is considered illegal, even though on a state level, it depends on the states. So when you see that a quarter of people between 18 and 20 are using drugs, it may be misleading. Now, if we look at the graphic, as one gets older, the rates of drug use decreases, right? So this is an interesting graphic. With the peak drug use ages being late teens and early 20s as being the most common times for people to party. And that shouldn't shock you, right? Because your late teens, early 20s is when you're experimenting with freedom and liberation and defying one's parents and making one's own choices. You might be out of the house, going to school, and with that less regulation, people start to make other choices. And drugs and alcohol are part of those choices. Now, in terms of marijuana usage, we do see that males tend to use marijuana more frequently than females. People who are single use marijuana more often than married individuals do. And one of the reasons is that there's more accountability and responsibility among marrieds, right? So you have a partner saying, don't do that. You also have a person saying, hey, we have to pay our utilities and our rent or our mortgage. So they're not going to be excited about you spending money that could be used for the bills, the utilities, or traveling, or your connection on drugs. And we tend to see, similar to the previous graphic, younger individuals use more marijuana than older individuals. And one of the factors linked to this is that when you enter the workforce, um, partying becomes less exciting because you have to wake up in the morning, you have to go to work, you have to do things. So the idea of staying out all night and partying, well, it'll interfere with your job performance. So you're less likely to want to do that. Now, we talked about drugs, but we also have to talk about nutrition. So our culture puts an emphasis on food, exercise, and body shape, which is interesting because it plays a role on identity. So when we talk about food, we in the United States have a strong emphasis on fast food consumption because it's quick, it's cheap, and we're on the go. But that in of itself runs contrary to another ideal, which is body image, because one of the things we see about eating fast food is it increases the risk for obesity. But there's a strong emphasis on either being muscular among males or being thin among females. And these are the body image ideals pushed in the United States. So that becomes an issue. Now, I will say that body image across the globe is different, right? So in the United States, we have a thinness ideal or we have a muscularity ideal. But in other parts of the world, the drive for thinness is not there. So there are parts of the world where being thin implies levels of poverty, whereas being overweight implies rich, being wealthy. So there's a beauty in that. So, and then of course, exercise plays a role for both muscularity and thinness. Now, when we talk about um, death rates, we have to, and psychological problems, we have to pay attention to the role of socioeconomic status. People who have lower socioeconomic status die prematurely. And that's interesting because you're like, well, why is it that people who have lower income or who live in poverty die early? Well, they have um, less access to healthy foods, so they have poorer nutrition, poorer housing, uh, insufficient prenatal care, less access to healthcare facilities and education. And all of these are stressors. And stress is the universal trigger for all physical and mental health problems. Now, when we talk about psychological factors, we see that women are more likely to develop depression than men on average. It's about a 2-to-1 rate difference. And then we see African Americans are more likely to develop depression than Caucasians. What's interesting is that if we look at Black males, they tend to have the same rates of depression roughly as young females. So it goes back to stress factors. There are unique pressures that are put on women and ethnic minorities that a person who's part of the white majority culture may not appreciate. So that stress predisposes one towards depression. All right. So now, in terms of one's health, we also have to talk about mental health. Right? Mental health is constantly adapting, and When we think of the pandemic that occurred in 2020, uh, it's going to affect not just the physical health, but the psychological health or mental health of people on an ongoing basis. So, what we're going to have to keep track of the outcomes as a function of the pandemic to see, whether this altered the mental health in a significant way. Now, to be mentally healthy, it requires resiliency. It requires the ability to adapt to life's fortunes and misfortunes, right? Um, and it requires us to be able to successfully navigate the responsibilities of life and carry them out in a meaningful way. And ultimately, when someone says mental health, it uh, is a subjective sense of well being. So let's talk about stress. Stress, as I said, is the universal trigger to both physical and psychological problems. Now, stress creates a threat to self esteem, it creates a threat to well being. Now, we all have varying levels or degrees of stress. And what we find is that if you have social support, that is, friends and family who help you cope, that buffers against many of the negative consequences of stress that I talked about on the previous slides. We also tend to see that the younger generation is more stressed out than older adults. So younger young adults are very stressed. And one interesting finding, right, related to the pandemic is that there is an absolute spike in anxiety in college students. And that spike is linked to uncertainty. Now, imagine you're in college and you have your whole life in front of you, and you're perfectly planned and you envision what you're going to do with your life, and then the pandemic occurs. It's almost like the whole carpet was pulled out from underneath you. So your whole plan has been upset. So it's very important for people to be as flexible as possible and be patient and tolerate the uncertainty that we have, because no one knows how long we are going to be in a state of pause, a state of um, stopping all the activities we once enjoyed. So it's interesting. A journalist reached out to me because of one of my roles through this state psychological association, and they were asking a question about whether I believe that there's going to be higher rates of seasonal affective disorder, which is a type of major depression with seasonal onset. Uh, and I said, in all likelihood, the answer is yes, but we have to track it. And we have to track it because it requires 2 years to see it. And the question is, will we be in the same position 2 years out? I'm not sure. But uh, it certainly will be interesting to see how this goes. And we're already seeing from the Center for Disease Control symptoms, not diagnosis, but symptoms of increased anxiety, depression, substance use, stress and trauma related conditions, and suicidal thoughts and ideations, right? So there are significant issues. But younger adults, we see that one of the groups that is at higher risk for all of these mental health concerns are younger adults, because uh, your life has been put on pause and you haven't been able to establish a career. Some of you aren't sure how you're going to make it to graduation and so forth. Um, Now, people who are married, we tend to see among married couples, and um, this doesn't matter whether you're in a same-sex relationship or heterosexual relationship. It doesn't matter. Married women, on average, tend to report being stressed out more than men, right? And part of that is one of these social rules where males are supposed to be tough and expressing one's feelings and vulnerability. Um, that's usually dissuaded, but there is a genuine difference between how women experience marriage and how men experience marriage, and there are a lot of factors around that. But I will move on for now. And when we talk about sexuality, um, heterosexuality means that a person is attracted to an individual of the opposite sex. So we tend to see by 22, 90% of young adults are already having sex, many of which have already had multiple sex partners. And what's interesting is that society, again, could both help or hurt our next generation. And technology is quite useful, except there are dating apps that are just for hooking up. And I'm not suggesting that people who hook up are bad people, but it increases the risk of sexually transmitted diseases. So, because access to a larger number of partners is there, we're seeing young adults having numerous partners in terms of premarital sex, attitudes towards homosexuality, masturbation, sexual satisfaction, things like that. There's no difference across the genders on attitudes. And then the majority of young adults claim to have one partner in the previous year. Uh, now, when we talk about attitudes towards the LGBTQIA community, um, it's things have changed, right? So people have described sexuality as either you're heterosexual or you're homosexual, and sexual orientation is more than that. There are so many other categories or options that one can fall into. And it's interesting, at the latest Supreme Court justice hearing with Amy Coney Barrett, there was a moment where she used the term sexual preference versus the term sexual orientation, which is the term we use today. And that distinction is important, right? Saying sexual preference implies that a person has a choice to whom they're attracted, when in reality, attraction happens naturally. And we're either attracted to a person based on their gender, right? Based on that, or we're attracted to them based on some kind of soul connection. So it's interesting. You can have a person who's heterosexual, homosexual, bisexual, pansexual, and so forth. And there are many different ways that we're shifting. So our conceptualization, putting people into boxes, you're either this or that. I'm imploring you to go beyond those binary terms, both for gender and sexual orientation, because people don't fit neatly into boxes that we place them in. One thing that was really incredible is during the President Obama's administration is marriage equality was made legal in all 50 states, which meant that a person whose state law prohibited people are part of the LGBT community from getting married could no longer block marriages or could no longer ignore these marriages because under federal law, which supersedes state law, the federal law said it was legal. And that's a big deal. And in fact, going back to the discussion we had about Justice Amy Coney Barrett, one of the questions around her was whether or not she was going to overturn this Marriage Equality Act. And there was a lot of questions around that. And pardon the pun, but the jury is still out on that. But it's interesting how our attitudes have changed towards LGBT communities. And there are generational differences. If you look at your parents and your grandparents and your great-grandparents, you'll see a difference generationally related to attitudes towards the LGBT community as well. Now, that's physical development. Let's talk about cognitive development. Now, it's interesting. According to the traditional lens, Piaget had 4 stages, right? And the formal operations where he had abstract thought, according to Piaget, occurred in adolescence. But there are some people, some psychologists who came after Piaget who proposed that there is a post-formal operations stage. And in this stage, adults understand that knowledge is relative versus the way we believed it to be absolute. Now, teenagers are notorious for being very idealistic, utopian, and looking for that which is fair, just, or right. And one of the things that we learn in adulthood is that looking for that singular answer is not always going to happen. The world is messier than we thought. So there is no absolute truth. It's more of a subjective truth. We also learn to embrace contradictions between one's life and knowledge, right? And that's important because hypocrisy is abound. So understanding that there are contradictions between knowledge and how one lives their life, and that's part of it, is incredible. And then one thing that people look for is that purpose in life, or that all-encompassing whole that organizes their experience for the rest of adulthood. So these are the 3 major characteristics of the post-formal operation stage. Now, we also talked about morality, but Lawrence Kohlberg had his stage theory of morality when he went from pre-conventional, conventional, post-conventional. Pre-conventional is based on reward and punishment. Conventional is based on the rules of society. And post-conventional is sort of developing your own value system about morality that supersedes what society says. It's interesting to note that according to Kohlberg, males scored higher on these stages of morality than females. And Carol Gilligan responded to Kohlberg, and she really criticized him to say, you know, one of the reasons why males scored higher on his test was that the dilemmas or moral problems that were presented were loaded towards justice. And males tend to have more of a justice orientation, whereas females tend to have more of a compassion or responsibility orientation. And if Kohlberg's moral dilemmas or moral problems were more based on compassion and responsibility, females would have scored higher. So in reality, I think both overstated the case for morality. Now, Eric Erikson is your psychosocial development, and we're now in the 6th of 8 stages. In early adulthood, you're looking for intimacy versus isolation. Intimacy is defined as a close emotional bond with a romantic partner. Isolation is where you don't, if you're not able to secure that connection. So, what are some of the tasks? I keep talking about tasks and responsibilities of young adults. Well, so here are some of the tasks. One thing is selecting a mate, so finding a partner, learning how to live with a marriage partner. By the way, you don't necessarily have to get married, but this is one of the ideas: is most people will eventually get married, start a family, have children, manage a home, get a job, take some responsibility within society, and have a friend network. So let's go through them. When selecting a mate or finding a romantic partner, there are a lot of factors that play a role in selecting a mate. Historical events play a role. Race and ethnicity plays a role. It's interesting that there still is a pressure, and it's less pronounced in this generation as previous generations, but there is a pressure for people to date within their own race or ethnicity. Social class. There's challenges around people who are of different financial classes. Religion's an interesting one. We still find that religion is a source of challenge in relationships, whether you have a religion versus don't have a religion, or whether you have competing religions, that becomes a factor. Now, all of these issues in selecting a mate are things to think about because of what research suggests. Whether you want to live in a city or a rural community, all of these are sources of stress. And age expectations. Age expectations is an easy one, right? We tend to see that in our society there's an emphasis, not that it's the right or wrong, but there's an emphasis on males being older than females, right? So that's the age expectation, and that has a whole lot to do with some evolutionary theory as well as some social norms. Now, one thing I would say to you, if as you're preparing to select a mate, take your time. Take your time and make the decision knowledgeably. You're not in a rush, right? Because what we find is that nearly 1 out of 2 marriages end up in divorce. So if you spend a little time thinking about what you value and making sure the person that you're with values the same or similar things, it's going to set you up for success in that relationship. Because the more inconsistencies in your value system, the more challenges you're going to have interpersonally. And what's interesting is there is a scientist by the name of Tai Tashiro who wrote a book called The Science of Happily Ever After. And in his book, he says that you only get 3 wishes. Now, one other thing that people do when trying to make a knowledgeable decision is that they say, well, what characteristics do I want in a person? And then they have a list of things they expect their partner to have. Well, the longer the list, the harder it is to find a person. So you might be looking for a unicorn, not a person, a mythical creature. And in his book, Tai Tashiro says, choose wisely because you only get 3 wishes. So when you're making that list, emphasize your top 3 values. In addition, there are other factors that play a role. Acknowledge. I don't want you to be overly influenced by, but acknowledge the social pressures to get married. And there are sayings, people on the clock, uh, things like that that make people feel like, oh, all my friends got married and I didn't. Or cultural pressures, right? So I know in Judaism, we emphasize early marriage. So there might be a pressure even earlier. So if I were to ask you, well, when do you think is a good time to get married? Many of you would likely say in your late 20s and 30s, which is actually a good answer because your personality is fully formed and financially you're a little bit more secure. But in Jewish culture, there is an emphasis to get married as early as 18, and you don't know yourself. But imagine being 23, 24 in a culture that people are getting married between 18 and 20. That's a challenge. And then the family plays a role. They're going to offer their unsolicited advice as to who or what um, is an appropriate partner. So just be mindful that people are going to weigh in. Now, so when we talk about relationships usually result in love. And one of my favorite theories to talk about is Sternberg's triangular theory of love. And triangular meaning it has three components: passion, intimacy, and commitment. So passion is your sexual attraction, intimacy is your closeness, commitment is how motivated you are to stay in the relationship, even if there's rocky times. Now, all three of these, if you have all three of them, you have consummate love. But it's possible that you have none or one or sometimes two of these. So based on this idea that there are three components to building love, Sternberg argues that there are different kinds of love. So if you have none of these features, then it's not love, right? If you have one of these features, if you have closeness and that's all you have, if you just have liking. If you have passion and that's all you have, according to him, you have infatuation. If all you have is commitment, then you have empty love. If you have two pieces, intimacy and passion would be romantic love, intimacy and commitment would be companionate love, passion and commitment would be fatuous love, and as I said, having all three would be consummate love. Now, people talk about love interests and they talk about soulmates. And the reality of the situation is that you don't have one soulmate based on what we find. People can have multiple people that they connect with. And in fact, when we study adults, we find that people have fallen in love 2, 3, 4, sometimes 5 times. And it doesn't matter whether you're male or female, males and females fall in love roughly the same amount on average. So there are no real differences in the frequency by which people fall in love. So when I talk to couples, I'm a clinical psychologist, and they're talking about relationship problems, I don't talk about a relationship as a soulmate. I talk about relationships in the terms of is this person good enough, whatever that means to you, that you can live a long life with them? Can you embrace the person with their flaws? If the answer is yes, that's a wonderful thing, right? If the answer is no, then you're going to have relationship problems, and potentially, if you're married, you might wind up divorced. Now, love is a powerful thing because love distinguishes between your friendships versus your romantic partner. Love is an added value that separates the different relationships. Now, being in love does not necessarily lead to the relationship that a person would necessarily predict, right? So uh, people can grow apart. People, we don't have a crystal ball. We don't see the future. Uh, but sometimes the relationships, there are curveballs, and we need to know that. Now, but at the common order of things is that long-term relationships, the vast majority of people who are in long-term relationships get married. So it remains the dominant lifestyle in the United States. Now there are people who are not getting married out of principle, and that number is actually growing in this generation. But nevertheless, the dominant value system, the dominant lifestyle is marriage, even in the United States. Now, uh, what's interesting is that I said that about half of people who get married are going to end up in divorce. Um, with that being said, um, people go from partner to partner on average with something called serial monogamy. That is moving one partner at a time from one to the next. We don't typically spend time with multiple partners at the same time. Now, that is the norm. That doesn't mean that there aren't people who have multiple partners at the same time. For example, there is a concept called being polyamorous, which means you have multiple love interests at the same time, and you discuss the rules of the relationship with your partner. So that's one concept. There is something called an open marriage. So we are not, again, I don't want to put people into boxes. I just warned us against it. But the most common scenario is serial monogamy. And in fact, one of the driving factors for divorce is infidelity. The person feels that they were cheated upon. Now, that happens when people don't keep to the value of monogamy that was understood in the relationship. Now, in this generation, dating has gotten more complicated. I'm 40 years old, so I'm not that old, but I think about dating as a teenager and as a young adult. You either were dating or you weren't. You were in a relationship or you weren't. And now there are all these stages. We're just talking. Just talking means that there's no commitment at that point. We're just trying it out. And then eventually you're in a relationship, and then you have to have a conversation about exclusivity, right? So there are these added stages that get put into the mix that weren't there, right? But marriage is common. So you might ask yourself, well, why get married, right? It's just a business contract, but it's not true. Marriage actually serves many functions, including psychological health. We find on average, people who are married tend to live longer and healthier lives. So marriage in general is a powerful experience. Another one of these goals is to learn how to live with your partner, your marriage partner, or just your partner in general, right? Because not everyone's getting married. So how do you learn to live with a person? You have to have caring and acceptance of them. You have to have good communication skills. So share, don't manipulate or martyr oneself. Embrace the uniqueness or the quirks of the individual, and see yourselves as intertwined. Now, I did say that there's a larger number of people who are either delaying marriage or not getting married at all. So these are people who are staying single. Now, in recent years, people who are staying single has increased, right? So we're talking about up to 35. So This is based on the tendency for people to postpone marriage. Now we're also postponing adulthood, right? We're staying at home longer. We're going to college. We're trying to figure ourselves out, and eventually we settle down. But there's a large group of people who are delaying the process, and that's okay. But because what we find, even in people are single up to 35, that the vast majority or two-thirds of these individuals, they live with someone else, whether it's a friend or relative or what they call a spouse equivalent. They have that interconnectivity to another person, albeit not a spouse. Now, couples have a choice eventually when or if they want to live together. So we tend to see that this is called cohabiting. People who cohabit together has increased pre-marriage from the past couple decades. So um, it's because there's more flexibility in society, more openness to the idea. But that doesn't mean that the younger generation is the only one who's doing it. We tend to see that people who are middle age or older adults who are divorced or are widowed also tend to cohabit with people outside of marriage. Now, separation and divorce, again, um, if I were to ask you how many of you are going to get married, most of you would raise your hand. Now, if I would ask you how many of you are going to get divorced, almost none of you would raise your hand, when in reality, about one out of every two of the hands that are raised are going to end up in divorce. So, but divorce does not have to be a bad thing, right? A divorce in a low conflict situation, that's that can be a good thing. That can be the healthiest thing for a couple. And many couples get along following a divorce and they still interact with one another, especially if they have children, that they're cordial. But in a high conflict divorce where the couple didn't get along in marriage, and then all the more so during the divorce process, after divorce process, there's bitterness. Divorce can cause a whole host of negative outcomes, such as mental health problems, anxiety, depression, alcoholism, sleep disorders, weight changes. All of those are linked to divorce. Now, the other decision, or another, I should say, not the other, another decision you have to make is to start a family. So you have to think about, well, what does it involve and what does it cost? So you may not realize it, but the cost of having a kid is about $1 million investment, right? So understanding that, you have to be prepared. Now, the family life cycle, everything is in flux. It's interesting. Earlier in the lesson, we said that your relationship isn't always what you plan it to be. And I think that's important because, um, you know, relationships undergo development the same way individuals undergo development. And we have a predictable life cycle in the United States and how you go about it. But here's the deal. There is a shift that happens, and there are major changes that have happened in the expectations, requirements on husbands and wives and their children when they're born and as they grow up. So there is a shift. So one shift in the life cycle is pregnancy, right? So pregnancy is a special time for a couple, but particularly for a woman who it's their first pregnancy, this is an unparalleled experience. In fact, you're going to, those of you who experience this, talk about it for the rest of your life. And that first pregnancy is what makes you a parent. It's what makes you a family. It adds that new responsibility of, taking care of a kid. So that first pregnancy is a transitional phase. And that pregnancy, it's interesting, that pregnancy comes with challenges too. Stress related to making sure that the baby is healthy and making sure that you eat properly. And I know we talked earlier in an earlier lesson about teratogens, right, and prenatal development. But when you think about it, these stressors are just few of the stressors. There are new financial stressors. There are new questions around the role of who you are in the relationship. One interesting finding is that new dads commonly become jealous of their child. And why do they become jealous? Well, one answer is that the attention shifts from the partner to the child, and rightfully so, but people weren't prepared for that adjustment or the development of the relationship. So, all right. So, in terms of this being a crisis, there are psychologists and sociologists who've said that this is a crisis for the relationship because it shifts from a dyad to a triad system, but many people have questioned this idea. Now let's talk about lesbian parenthood, right? So we talked a little bit about the mother and the father, but in terms of lesbian parenthood, for a long time, people who are part of the LGBT community were argued that they were inferior parents or somehow they were going to be a threat to parents. And there's no scientific evidence that that's true. So for a while, it was hard for people who are gay or lesbian to have surrogates and have kids. But what we find in research is that there's no evidence that lesbian mothers are less emotionally stable. And there's no evidence. Another argument for members of the LGBT community is that they're going to somehow engage in sexual abuse. There's no evidence that there's higher rates of sexual abuse among the LGBT community. In fact, here's the deal. It's actually more common amongst heterosexual individuals, sexual abuse. So that's what the data suggests. So ultimately, there's no real reason to interfere with lesbian parenthood other than people's bigotry. So some of the homophobia and societal disapproval really taxes the relationship, but objectively, lesbian parents are just parents. They're great parents. There's no difference between myself and them. Another interesting finding is life became more complicated after the 50s, right? So one of the cool changes in history was the women's liberation movement, right? So there's a wave of feminism that advocated for women to have greater role in society because society somehow previously thought that women were inferior or they could not manage competing responsibilities. And ultimately, women in the workforce, women are part of the workforce and they're an important part of the workforce. But one of the juggling acts that women occur or have when working is balancing motherhood and their career. So there's a sense of mom guilt in terms of not giving enough attention to one's kids, but they ultimately, when balancing it, it's a good thing. And we find that the psychological health of working moms is actually better than non-working moms. It gives a sense of purpose. So I strongly encourage it. I think that if someone wants to be in the workforce, they should be in the workforce. And ultimately, we see that those moms who are in the workforce are not inferior in terms of their caregiving abilities. Now, other considerations, if you have children, is do you have the time, energy, or support for this? Because you may have heard the phrase, it takes a village to raise a child. And that's true. You're going to need additional support to be effective. Now, what do you do with single parent households? I said earlier in the lesson that there's a large portion of people who, at one point or another, are going to be part of a single parent household. So, single parent mothers tend to struggle with childcare costs, loneliness, financial challenges, free time challenges, and nearly a half of these individuals live below the poverty line because of the lack of financial support. What's interesting is, I think that it's great. We see how important women in the workforce is, but one interesting negative outcome is that um, the economy adjusted for there being two people in the workforce. So all the prices went up. They got inflated because they said, oh, the household income went up because multiple people are working. So now, when you're a single parent and you don't have the means to pay for the cost of everything, it's going to affect you more adversely. Single parent dads, this is also happening. We're seeing um, that single dads, they're also struggling with adjustment, managing their careers as well as raising their children. And it's a juggling act, and finances are also an issue. So now the next thing you do, right? We're still going through these life goals of early adulthood. You have a decision whether to manage a home. Do you want to buy a home? Do you want to rent a home? You want a house or an apartment? Do you want to be in a big city or a small town? How do you pay bills, right? Do you have one account or multiple accounts? How do you manage the repairs and so forth? All of these factors play a role. Now, work is absolutely important. It's one of the two major life commitments in adulthood. And we find that for both men and women, work provides a sense of identity, a sense of purpose, and people tend to be happier when working. Now, when you start a career, you have decisions, right? You're in college, so I'm assuming you're looking to go towards one career or another, but you have decisions to make. So let's say you're becoming a nurse. You have to ask yourself, well, what does it require? What's the level of education, experience? Am I willing to relocate? How many work hours are there going to be? All of these are questions. And then if you're want to become a psychologist, right? You say, well, say you run it through the same process. Interesting to note, it takes fewer years of schooling to become a nurse than a psychologist. The entry level licensed psychologist in New York is the doctoral level. So, whereas a person can have an associate's or a bachelor's degree and become a registered nurse. And that isn't to suggest that, that's a bad thing. What it is that you have a decision to make. What kind of career do you want to do, and how many years of education will that require? All of that you have to put into the mix. Now, people start to volunteer and take on civic responsibilities, and this is going to become far more pronounced in middle adulthood, and you'll hear more about that. But people start to take on commitment in their schools and in their faith-based organizations. They might run for public office or volunteer for Meals on Wheels and things like that. This becomes part of the mix. Usually that happens in the second half of early adulthood when you are financially secure and you have the capacity to give back. Now, finding a social group, having a friendships is absolutely important. You must have friendships, and you don't need 200 friends. If you have 3 to 5 good friends, that's great. In terms of what your friend network looks like, it's very common at this point to have friends of any gender identification, whereas in early childhood, you usually hung out with the uh, same sex category. All right, so establishing intimacy in relationships. Intimacy, as I described, was a close emotional bond, and friendships provide social support. Now, women tend to have greater intimacy with other women, so they tend to get benefit from friendships a little bit more. They tend to also select friends who are in the same phase of life. So if people have kids, they're going to find friends that have kids, whereas men tend to find their friendships in work and recreation. Now, social media, when we talk about social media, I have mixed feelings about social media. I actually think that for all of its benefits in marketing, and if you're using social media for marketing purposes, that's one thing. But if you're using it as a sense of self esteem, social media has increased self consciousness and actually has increased things like cyberbullying and depression. Now, one cool thing that will happen in early adulthood is that you will become equal to your parents. You will develop an egalitarian relationship when you move out, and you're no longer receiving support from them. Then they will start to view you as an equal and treat you differently. Now, there is a whole group of people, or there are a whole group of people who are what we call failure to launch. These are individuals who are still living at home when there's the expectation that they should have moved out already. So if you're 40 years old living in your parents' basement, that's not a good thing, right? So, but the rate of failure to launch is actually increasing. Now, what's interesting is that people leave the home. We're seeing in this generation, it's common for people to leave the home and then actually come back because living on one's own is challenging, and sometimes people do the opposite. They move out prematurely. All right. So I'm going to, talk about, the social definitions for women, because I said women, women have unique pressures to men. And then um, that adds stress in early adulthood. So until about the 1950s or 1960s, it was commonly viewed that women's primary role was reproduction and parenthood. Whereas now, employment outside of the home is an important part of women's identity. So, one thing we have to think about is the concept of role conflict. And role conflict is when two competing pressures of two roles, the work role and a parent role, arise within one another. Or when we have role overload. Now they're not in conflict. It's just you're doing too much and you don't have enough time to fulfill all of the responsibilities. Each of these are unique to women because I've seen it. I've heard it in clients and whatnot where it's sort of the wife will come in and say, I work a full time job, but when I come home, I have another full time job waiting for me. We don't say the same thing about men. So there is this role overload that we have to consider. So I'm going to stop there. And next, we're going to talk about middle adulthood.